Paul's example, some more barbecue, and some bald ladies. Today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we are talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 9 through 11, and tomorrow we're going to jump into 1 Corinthians chapter 12 through 14. So let's see what the Bible has in store for us today. So here Paul is talking about his example as an apostle, right? And how apostles have certain rights. Right? So we get to verses 3 through 6 here in chapter 9, and Paul's rights as an apostle, which were exercised by the other apostles as well, include three things. One, the right to be compensated for his apostolic service or paycheck. Two, the right to take a believing wife so he could be married. And three, the right to refrain from outside work, devoting himself entirely to the ministry. So he ain't got to have another job. This could be his job, right? And he can make his living doing so. So in chapter 9, verse 8 to 11 here, Paul uses this greater to lesser argument to justify his right to an allowance. So if he has supplied spiritual things, which is the greater stuff, to the Corinthians, surely he ought to receive material things or benefits, which are lesser, from them in return, right? So we get to verse 12, and now Paul uses a lesser to greater argument to support the right to a living wage. If those who presently labored among the Corinthians received wages, then how much more should the ones who had founded the church get, right? Basically, Paul makes his point here from the Mosaic law in verse 13. Don't you know that those who perform the temple services eat the food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the offerings of the altar? So they're getting paid through that money that's going to the altar, right? So the lesson here is pay your preacher, folks. Pay your preacher. If this is what they're doing for a living, then pay them, and pay them good, and leave it up to them what they do with the money. So verse 14 here, the Lord has commanded, as it says, may refer to Luke chapter 10, verse 4 through 8, where Jesus says the gospel worker is worthy of his wages. So in verses 16 and 17, it says, I am compelled to preach. This alludes to Paul's commission at Damascus as a chosen instrument, who had been given a stewardship to discharge the message of the gospel to the nation. So he's getting paid here, right? Verses 20 to 22, the phrase not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, refers to Paul as one of those who had the right under God's law to receive wages, yet among Gentiles, he yielded that right. He didn't take it. So, like hard-driven runners and boxers, and the runner, of course, we see up on your screen here, Paul had a single-minded focus. His exercise of self-control was aimed at keeping him from being disqualified. Well, disqualified in this manner here doesn't necessarily mean the loss of salvation, which Paul elsewhere said is kind of impossible in Romans chapter 8, but rather failure to fulfill his God-given commission to evangelize to the nations. So Paul viewed his boxing opponent in his little allegory here as his own body. When it resisted giving up rights and liberties, he brought it under strict control, or literally translated, I enslave it, as he says. And then we move on to chapter 10. In chapter 10, to make very vivid the possibility of disqualification, as we were talking about, Paul drew on Exodus chapter 12 through chapter 17. These Hebrews enjoyed unique access to God, and they were all under the cloud of God's presence and were baptized into Moses. And yet, most of them were struck down, right? They were disqualified. The phrase that they all ate the same spiritual food points back to God's daily provisions, of course, for Israel in the wilderness. And, of course, he's wanting his daily provisions as well, I guess. So we get into verse 16 and 17 in chapter 10. And this is where we start getting into the meat of this. Paul wanted the Corinthians to know that participants at the Lord's Supper represent a unified body that is dependent on the death of Christ. Now the phrase, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, refers to the individual members who make up one corporate body, which is the church. In verses 18 to 22 here, actual idolatry is in view here, not merely partaking of foods offered to idols that we talked about in chapter 8, verse 1 through 13, right? This is participation in idolatrous rites, is a violation of the believer's union with Christ, and thus with the one body relationship that they had with other believers. So, there we are. And here we are with this thing about the food again, right? So Paul prohibited participation in pagan ritualistic meals because this involved intimacy with demons. And then we just talk about how he said, if this meat was sacrificed to these gods, it's fine. You can eat it. I mean, it's not a big deal because the gods aren't real, and that's really not sacrificing nobody. So you're not going to lose your salvation and go to hell all because you ate some food that some random person decided they're going to try to sacrifice to some random golden cow god, and then you eat it not knowing it. Then that's not how it works. So, but he continued to affirm this non-reality of idols as deities as he was talking, and as we talked about in chapter 8. But here, demons are both real and powerful. You see, demons exist. They actually are real. And the word "they" refers back to idolatrous Israel in the wilderness when they overlooked demonic presences, just as the Corinthian believers here were tempted to do in their pagan rituals to making sacrifices to demons. Now, what may seem like a surprising twist on what Paul had said in chapter 8 verses here, Paul said seeking the good of the other person meant that a believer who objected to buying meat that had been sacrificed to idols should not interrogate the meat sellers in order to certify that the meat had no association with idolatry. So Paul offered some scriptural support here for this position from Psalm chapter 24 verse 1, where he says the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. Therefore, partake of the meat out of gratitude and a clear conscience. You ain't gonna go burn in hell because you've ate some of this meat, but also don't go probing and asking and trying to get the location, where did this meat come from, who cooked it, what was it cooked for, was it involved in any, don't go interrogating people, right? The rule for eating in a pagan home is pretty much the same as the meat in the meat market. Don't go interrogating people about all this stuff. That's not the good thing. Paul only prohibited eating the meat if someone bothered explicitly to point out, hey, this food is from a sacrifice to a demon, right? So the Greek word here, which is hierotheutos, it meant devoted to a divinity. So this rare Greek term was used by pagans to designate meat that was devoted to a particular god. And in this situation, the food's history did matter because the person who pointed it out, whether he was a non-believing Gentile or a Christian that was of weak conscience, apparently he felt that a Christian eating such meat would be compromising to his allegiance to Christ. So he's trying to lead you astray in that scenario. Don't eat the meat, right? So essentially what this all boils down to is just do everything you do for the glory of God, right? And people who do wish to do everything for the glory of God cannot succeed if we act in disregard to others, right? We just can't. So just do what you do for the glory of God and not worry so much about that. And then here we go in chapter 11, instructions about head coverings. Woo, boys, gets into some stuff today. This says here in chapter 11, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So Paul's wanting you to follow his ways because he feels that he is imitating Christ. So if you imitate him, you're imitating Christ, right? Well, I'm going to tell you, none of them are perfect, but Paul's pretty good. He does a pretty good thing here. Now, verse 2, keep this in mind here. It says, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold fast to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. He's a traditionalist. Let's just call it like it is. In verse 4 it says, every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. So I ask you, how many of your ladies in church are going to church and covering their head up, putting a hat on before they go to the altar to pray? If we go by this, according to that thought process. They're going to have a whole lot of bald women in the world, right? Well, that's not exactly what all this is about, but you kind of get the gist of it. The situation here in these verses basically assume a public setting where corporate worship is happening, right? So Paul applies the principle that Christ is the head of every man to the praying man. Now, outward manifestations of piety should not dishonor a believing man's head, or Christ. Christ is the head, right? The phrase "with something on his head" is literally having down alongside his head. Now, this practice here actually refers not to putting a hat on your head, but to the Roman practice of pulling down the toga over the head while bowing for pagan worship. So when they bow down to it, they pull the toga over their head, right? And Paul's saying, don't do this. Don't be like pagans and do this stuff, right? And because of this association of this practice with a pagan worship service, the male believer dishonored his true head, which was Christ, when he covered his physical head with this toga. So by imitating pagan practice, he shamed Christ and himself. Now, in the first century, a woman would speak with her head uncovered only in private settings or at pagan club meetings in private homes. Now, Paul did not give a reason why women in the church at Corinth were uncovered. It may be that they brought into the church religious practices that had paralleled habits from their old pagan meetings. Now, Paul explained why a Corinthian woman's uncovered head here dishonored her head, that a woman who prayed or prophesied with her head uncovered was one and the same with the one having her head shaved, and because a head being shaved for a woman was disrespectful, and Paul equated the shame of this uncovered head imitating the practice of pagan private religious clubs, because with the shame of a person who publicly expressed a pagan dedication, they would have to have their hair cut off or her hair shaved. Pagan women at Corinth were sometimes shearing their own hair and dedicating their locks as a token of worship or fulfillment of a vow to a god. Which would have been their pagan god. So in the Corinthian setting, the uncovered head paralleled practices in pagan clubs and thus blurred the divisions between devotion to the true God and false gods. So here they are with these cultural things that are being carried over. So this resulted in dishonor to a believing woman's husband and to Christ. So a man's uncovered head honored his head because it permitted the immediacy of his reflection of the image and glory of God. Therefore, he should not cover his head in imitation of pagan practice. Now, Paul's second reason for saying that a woman's uncovered head dishonored her head is that the first woman was created for man, right? So a woman completes the man in God's created order in the sense that man mirrors the image of God and woman reflects the glory of the man. Now, this does not mean that a woman is inferior to a man in any way. It's she actually completes God's creation of man as male and female and brings glory to man. And then the third reason why a woman's uncovered head dishonored her head is difficult to interpret, because it's talking about here, and this is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So perhaps the church's witness to the angelic hosts would be adversely affected by an uncovered female head. We don't know. The phrase authority on her head seems to refer to an outward symbol that signified to the angels her deference to leadership. In other words, her submission to them. Who knows? It's pretty tough. But then we get to verse 11 through 16, and this is where it really gets exciting here. These verses have yielded various interpretations and have stirred up some controversy at times. Though Paul addresses the man's headship role in marriage, which is rooted in creation. He also acknowledges that men and women are not independent of one another. In the beginning, woman was formed from man, but through childbirth, man also comes through woman, and all things come from God, so including gender distinctions, if you think about it. For a woman in Corinth to pray with her head uncovered was to deny these gender distinctions between male and female. Regardless of the specific local cultural expressions, hear that word, cultural expressions, right? To deny male-female differences in worship, it would be improper, it would be contrary to nature, and in opposition to the practices of all the churches that were around. So I'm going to read this to you, and let's just read it at face value at this point, knowing the historical context. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? Well, I think about that and I think, well, what about Samson? He had long hair and it was his source of his power, and wasn't that kind of granted by God until Delilah cut it off. And it says here, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. So for her hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom. Hear this, custom, nor do the churches of God. Well, Paul, guess what? We do have different customs now. We didn't then, but now our customs are a little bit different. I have to point out that a lot of this has to do with tradition, as we talk about in verse 2. Culture, as we talked about in verses 11 through 16, and the customs of the times, and the different religious practices of the different religions commingling together. One of the things that Paul was doing here is Paul was growing a church, right? And what do you do when you need people to change? You start changing gradually. You change things gradually through the culture. And what we've seen through Paul's writings over and over is that's exactly what Paul's doing. He is a conduit of change here, and he is changing their culture a piece at a time as we go through all of these readings and through these letters, as they start facing problems where this religion is countering the culture of the time. Paul is giving them instructions on how to gradually change that culture to grow the church. Now, that culture can also work counterculturally, as we see today in the United States, counterculturally to this. As Christians, we're falling away. There's a great falling away because our culture has changed so much from the traditions that are in the Bible that many Christians are falling away from the Bible. So change works both ways. We can use culture to change people for the better, and then culture can be used to change people in a different direction. So I hope this has helped you in your studies today. If it has, click that like button and subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you get notified the next time I upload a video. And if you're rumbling with me on Rumble, hit that little boxing glove. And we'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. See you then.